Hey, Mark Safe here again. For many players, bluffing is the true essence of poker. These players believe you're not really playing the game if you're not gambling and putting your opponents to the test, even when you're not holding the best hand. If you've ever seen me play, you know how much I love to bluff. In fact, you could say it's one of my favorite weapons in my arsenal. In some ways, these people are right. But like everything else in poker, there's more to bluffing and bluffing successfully than meets the eye. So before you go sticking your money into the pot with no real shot at winning, we're going to teach you how to make your bluffs pay off even when you get caught. There are two main things to consider when you bluff. First, is my bluff likely to work right now and win me this pot? Second, and more important, is even if my bluff doesn't work right now, will getting caught help me win more money later on? The reason this is so important and why bluffing is important in general is because it shows your opponents that you're willing to bet when you're not holding the best hand. It throws them off. If you're not willing to bluff on occasion, your opponents will be able to narrow your range of holdings very easily when you play, and you'll be less likely to get paid off on times when you're holding a real hand. Your opponents will know that when you bet, you've got the goods. So now that you understand the reasons for bluffing, we're going to give you a checklist to determine if you should be bluffing with the hand that you're holding. The first thing to consider before bluffing is your opponent. Specifically, what you need to consider is if he's willing to lay down a hand that can beat yours. If your opponent won't ever lay down a hand, either because he isn't smart enough to fold or because he's so committed to the pot, then you shouldn't be bluffing this opponent in this hand. The second item to consider is how many opponents you're facing. In general, bluffing against just one opponent will be much more successful than bluffing against multiple opponents. With a lot of players in the hand, it's more likely that someone has a pretty strong hand and has connected with the board. If you're bluffing against multiple opponents, be sure that you actually have a way to win the hand with something like a flush draw or straight draw. This is also known as a semi-bluff. The next item to consider is your position in the hand and whether you're betting first or last. As we've seen in previous lessons, position is critically important in every hand. This is especially true when you're bluffing because you can see when your opponents appear to be weak, and you can set up a bluff on the turn by calling your opponent's bet on the flop. What's more, bluffing from position is also cheaper than bluffing out of position because when you're the first to act, your bluffs usually take the form of a check raise, which forces you to commit much more money to the pot than you would by just betting out on your own. Another item to consider is whether the board will help make your bluffs believable. Remember, it's super important that our story makes sense. If the board is textured well, in other words, you've got some high cards, you've got a straight draw or flush draw, your bluff will carry more weight if a scare card falls on the turn or the river. Finally, you should think about whether or not your hand could actually win if you get called. As we mentioned, this semi-bluff is especially important in multi-way pots where at least one of your opponents is likely to have connected with the board. For example, a classic semi-bluff would involve betting something like a flush draw when you're holding, say, a king-jack of spades on a board of 10 of spades, 8 of spades, deuce of clubs, 5 of hearts. If your opponent bets into you, you can still raise and win the pot if you hit your flush card, or you may even win the pot if you hit a king or a jack on the river. When it comes to the second requirement of bluffing, whether getting caught will help make you money in later hands, you need to go through a simple checklist as well. First, you need to ask yourself whether your opponents are paying attention to whether you're bluffing or not. If your opponents aren't paying close attention, then getting caught bluffing won't help you because it won't affect their play going forward. Second, you need to determine whether your opponents are loose or tight. If your opponents are already playing very loose, then there's no need to bluff against them because you're already going to get enough action from them when you're holding real hands.